From the dawn of civilization, mankind has found ways to record sexual experience. From the paintbrush to the printing press, through the birth of photography and film to videotape and the infinite possibilities of the computer, humanity has used every technological step forward to portray the sexual act. Each new medium has created new pornographic forms, bringing it to an ever broader audience. In turn, technological advances have frequently been propelled by the powerful urge to see images of sex. In this series, we trace the tangled relationship between pornography and technology and uncover the secret history of civilization.
Pornography hasn't always existed. It's not a natural idea. It's an invention of Victorian science. And most other cultures don't have a concept of pornography.
We begin with a tale of two civilizations, the ancient Romans and the Victorians. The first has been dead and buried for nearly 2 millennia. The second are our nearest ancestors, whose values and concerns we inherit. In the collision of these two powerful cultures, we find the origins of what we now know as pornography.
Pornography is the inheritance of Victorian conceptualizations. We like to think that pornography is natural. It's not natural, it's a modern cultural invention. And the discovery of Pompeii was profoundly important in the history of the term.
In the mid-18th century, an Italian peasant stumbled upon the remains of the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius nearly 17 centuries earlier. As excavators dug, they revealed an untouched record of ancient Roman life. The frozen city immediately gripped the public imagination. But as the excavators uncovered more of this petrified town, they experienced the first tremors of unease. As each new villa was revealed, this unease turned to anxiety, and anxiety to panic. The noble ancient world that they were exposing was one which, in their eyes, was contaminated at every turn by the obscene. Among the first objects they unearthed was a marble statue. It depicted the Roman god Pan in explicit sexual intercourse with a goat, provoking both horror and fascination. The excavators' panicked response to this image began a process which would culminate in the legal prohibition of sexually explicit material, which today we describe as pornography.
The removing of the pan and the goat from the culture that it was embedded in and putting it away started a process that still continues today, that is cordoning off sexual representation from the rest of life. For the Romans, it was part of a continuum. For us, it's still a very scary thing. We believe in the power of images of sex to create disturbance.
What happened when we discovered Pompeii was that for the first time it became impossible to avoid the fact that you could see pictures of people copulating all over rooms, all over painted walls. This caused immense trouble for the people who discovered all this imagery. The whole of Europe traced its own roots in different ways back to classical culture. So the discovery of Pompeii and its obscenity was a threat not just to people's idea of the ancient world, but to their very idea of who they were. So what did you do with it? What they tried to do, first of all, was deny it, and then when it became quite impossible to deny, it had to be somehow locked away. It couldn't be destroyed because of the fascination with its great new classical source, and it couldn't be put on display. So people discovered the idea of classifying it, but classifying it away, hiding it in a museum.
The rooms containing the obscene paintings were barred and bolted, and all movable objects like the pan and the goat were transported to a secret room within the Museo di Borbonico at nearby Naples and placed under lock and key.
Well, here we have it, what remains of the secret museum in Naples. Anything that came in that was regarded as obscene was shoved in here. And this piece here, extraordinary piece of work, is in a sense the beginning of the collection, because here on the face of it we have one of the most unacceptable scenes you could ask for, explicit bestiality. But for the Romans, this could be nothing but a source of amusement and admiration at its wit and its skill. Every detail is worked out lovingly, so that if you look at the face of Pan, you see he has a nose that's partly human, but it's turning into a goat's nose. And you have the nanny goat with these little dewlaps hanging from her, and so on. That detailing is applied to the sexual congress too. Normally with a statue, the bits that you can't easily see are only roughed out. But with this, if you peer down and look in detail, you find that the genitals, both of Pan and the nanny goat, are fully visible. And this was, in its original context, displayed in absolutely full public view.
There was absolutely no way to deal with it except lock it up and only let gentlemen see it, gentlemen of a certain culture, and keep it away from people who are ignorant. And of course, that includes the poor, women, and children. Remember, just to see, a woman's ankle was considered erotic. To find all these different kinds of sexual representation blew their minds. Here we have, for instance, a painting that has suffered from probably a prudish digger. The woman is guiding the man's penis into her vagina, and that whole area has been defaced. It makes it harder to figure out what the meaning of this particular image is and why the man's hand is up like this in the air. He's wearing a banquet wreath, which means that he's in a party mood, and she has her hair all done up as well. She's quite pretty. And she's straddling him, and it's obviously time to go to the next stage. This particular picture, I think, was the pièce de résistance of this particular room. Now, this dates to probably about 10 years before Vesuvius erupted, maybe the 60s AD. She has her right knee drawn up behind his torso, and he's lifted her left leg up so that he can get better entrance. These were proper pictures to have in their house. If you have a proper picture collection, you must have some really good pictures of people doing it. And if you don't, well, you just don't have any taste. You don't understand the proper values of your society. And what we do by cordoning it all off and putting it into a secret room is to create pornography, essentially. We create it by putting this stuff out of Romans' lives.
Until the mid-19th century, the modern concept of pornography did not exist. There was no word to describe images on the basis of their sexual content because one had not been needed. The word pornography itself is an arcane Greek term, and it first appears in an English medical dictionary in 1857. Initially, the word was neutral, used to describe social and medical texts on the rapidly accelerating problem of prostitution. But within the space of 5 years, a second, morally pejorative definition appears in Webster's dictionary. This is the word as we now understand it.
Pornography was invented by the Victorians as a term, in at least the sense that we think about pornography today. It's a way in which culture was trying to police itself.
The Victorians really are worried that if people were exposed privately to sexually explicit imagery, this would actually disturb the person who was consuming these images. And I suppose the ultimate fear was that they would resort to masturbation. And having resorted to this, they would become addicted. They would want to consume more and more and more and more, and therefore they would become sort of constant masturbators. The ultimate fear being that in losing this sort of sacred seed, men would become enfeebled, they would become effeminized, and they would degenerate. And the Victorians did draw equations with other cultures. The Roman Empire was seen to decline through sort of, masturbatory form of behavior.
The last thing in the world that would have occurred to a Roman looking at one of these pictures in one of these rooms would be to masturbate. That was a waste of a good thing. One would actually want to have some sort of sex that was a lot more stimulating and more fun. These are really images that are meant to give you a sense of life's pleasures. And, excavators found them everywhere. They found them in plain view in the public areas of a house. They found them sometimes in rooms like this, which are off the main room of the house. Sometimes they found them off of dining suites. What it shows is that people were proud of them. They wanted to show them to the people who came to see them in their houses.
The Victorians assumed that these images were masturbated over in private. But the Roman house was an open public space. They did not even have a word for privacy. Without the notion of privacy, the concept of pornography would have been incomprehensible. Once privacy exists, pornography becomes possible.
For the Victorians, privacy is a central element. You read in private, you have these secret places, and they lead to secret acts. And a lot of Victorian regulation is to do with trying to control those elements of secrecy. In Rome, to talk very generally, we talk about the public sense of the self. A Roman's sexuality was talked about in the public light of day, and there wasn't that sense of a secret, private, hidden realm where pornography took place.
In 1857, just as the word first appeared in the dictionary, the Victorians were launching an official campaign against obscenity. The Obscene Publications Act, which banned the sale of pornographic works, was passed by Parliament. The intervention of the state in the arena of sexual imagery was one of the most dramatic and far-reaching undertakings of the century. It shifted the focus from sex itself and created a legal structure around the act of looking at sex that still exists today.
Pornography starts when you want to have state regulation, when you want to draw up a set of laws that are going to try and control the images. In ancient Rome, there were images of sexuality all around. Sexuality was a normal part of life. You could see erect phalluses, you could see images of people copulating, you could see bawdy Roman comedies. But there were ways of regulating sexual behavior through just general forms of social regulation. The trouble comes when you start to say that the problem is in the object, in the image itself, and not in the person who's looking. Because you can't regulate the internal feelings of a person, you can't say there is a law against being sexually stimulated, the Victorians had to try and draw up a list of things that were likely to, as they put it, deprave and corrupt. And all the problems of legislation come from this tension, that in the ancient world it was a problem for self-control, as opposed to in the modern world where we try and regulate images by state law.
Pictures never hurt anybody, and the Romans said this over and over again, particularly pictures of sex. If you were to say to me, an ancient Roman living in this house, you can't look at this picture, it's bad, I would laugh at you and say, well, what do you know that I don't know? There's nothing bad about this. In fact, it's quite beautiful. I guess I would ask you, well, you mean it's badly painted? What they were concerned with was regulating class and regulating who did what to whom. And that's an entirely different matter.
While the Romans did not repress any sexual images, sexual behavior was subject to strict social control.
If you are a male, you must penetrate only. That is, you insert your penis into the mouth, anus, or vagina of another person. You never allow yourself to be penetrated. And here we have a woman who is kneeling by the side of a bed and filleting a man. Any self-respecting woman, including even a poor woman, would never admit to ever doing this because it was the province of prostitutes, something you would have to pay a prostitute to do. They have this fixation on the purity of the mouth. The various discourses about the pure mouth relate immediately to, and this is quite interesting, to oratory. The mouth is the organ of speech, and it's the way that you end up communicating in the political commonweal. It's the way you make yourself a true citizen. Now this is yet another sexual role turned upside down. The Romans thought of cunnilingus not as the man's tongue invading the woman's vagina, but rather as her vagina penetrating his mouth. She was forcing her vagina onto the mouth of a man. And imagine what this means in terms of oral purity for the man. It's just as bad, if not worse, than performing fellatio on a male. The only reaction that a Roman could have looking at these paintings was outrageous laughter. It's not that they're explicit, it's that they're showing activities that are specifically taboo in very specific ways. And they're put here in the suburban baths for a very specific purpose. When you come in to bathe, what you do is you take your clothes off, of course, in the dressing room. And the Romans believed rather superstitiously that if someone looked at you and you were particularly beautiful, they could emanate particles from their eyes, known as the evil eye, that would harm you or even make you sick and kill you. So the antidote for that in many places, and not just here, is to get people to laugh. Because you can't be there grudging your envy and putting your evil eye into somebody if everybody is cackling and giggling and having a great time. And it's by breaking these rules in visual imagery that the artist got people to laugh here. He takes all of the stereotypical proper things that you're supposed to do and turns them upside down.
The transgressive images of Pompeii were locked away from view, and the idea that sexual images would harm was now enshrined in law. 19th century culture had succeeded in creating two secret museums, a literal one in Naples and a metaphorical one, which now existed in a legal document and in the minds of an entire culture.
One of the ideas integral to pornography is that it has an aggressive power, particularly on the vulnerable of Victorian society. That's to say, for Victorian society, women, children, and the working classes. What the Secret Museum did was to segregate this material, as the word pornography tries to segregate a set of ideas, and make the material unavailable to precisely those people. So in a sense, the Secret Museum does to objects what pornography is doing to ideas. It's trying to create a special space where we can keep the obscene, but keep it away from the people we don't want to have contact with it.
By the mid-19th century, the Secret Museum had been accepted as a means of covertly limiting access to the pornography of the past, just as the Obscene Publications Act was regulating the pornography of the present. Across Europe, public institutions formed their own secret cabinets. In 1865, a museum secretum was established at the British Museum in London. The secretum housed the collection of the erotic connoisseur George Witt. Witt was elected to the Royal College of Surgeons at the early age of 29, but later abandoned his medical career and sailed to Australia. He transferred his energies to banking and began consolidating his collection. Witt returned to London a wealthy man, bringing his collection with him. But in 1865 he fell seriously ill. When he recovered, he wrote to the board of the British Museum, donating his entire collection. Within the secretum is an object that links Witt to the network of gentlemen connoisseurs who had penetrated the secret museum of Naples. A terracotta copy of the infamous Pan and the Goat, one of the first hostages to the secret museum, pointing to a clandestine network of connoisseurs and scholars, public museums, and covert private collections.
Those persons wishing to see the collections within the secretum would have written to the director of the museum or to the head keeper. And they would have gone through a very, very stringent cross-examination, if you like. It was carefully calculated to weed out all but the most scholarly and the most honest. So no one would be allowed to see this collection unless basically that they were men, they were middle class, and they were scholars. And these are his own scrapbooks. And these are all of Witt's original notes and collected drawings, photographs, representations of material which he was interested in, which he collected himself, which he'd seen in other museums, and probably also in other private collections. And you can see Witt's own copy of the catalogue of the Secret Museum in Naples here, with his own bookmark. So we have a link here between the Secret Museum in Naples and collectors living in London in the middle of the 19th century. The scrapbooks, the collections themselves, tell us something about a very private world of collecting that was a very exclusive activity, generally conducted by gentlemen scholars, well-educated people. And it's quite clear from many of the scrapbooks that a lot of this material was being exchanged between collectors, that somebody who'd seen something in a museum in another country had drawn an item and sent an illustration to Witt. And basically one's looking at the proceedings of a very small club of people through these scrapbooks. They were gentlemen of taste, arbiters of taste, who felt that they could actually identify the fine line between obscenity and art themselves. This was up to them and nobody else.
The learning and social standing of erotic connoisseurs like Witt and his associates placed them beyond the reach of the Obscene Publications Act. These were men who could be trusted to maintain an icy objectivity towards material which might inflame those with weaker constitutions. These were the possessive guardians of the secret museum.
A connoisseur has to be someone who's wealthy, usually a gentleman of property and of money, in order to travel. A connoisseur also has to be a person of knowledge. They have to have the time and the leisure to accumulate information and to digest it, analyse it and publish it. Thirdly, the connoisseur has to be someone who's seen to be of a sort of state of mind, or who has the aesthetic sensibility to actually sort of look upon a whole variety of sexually explicit images and analyse them. The idea being that for a man, a respectable man, the mind, on the moral sense, had to win over the baser instincts, which were still there, but they had to be sort of locked away, sealed away from the public face.
The cryptic sexual symbolism of ancient cultures fed the 19th century obsession with classification. New sciences were bringing the chaos of the world under the control of human knowledge. The instinct was to name, to define and contain through the regulation of the present and the classification of the past.
All this material is being excavated from the past. Therefore, the data has to be classified, it has to be catalogued. And in doing so, the scholars or the antiquarians are actually making sense of the past. Also, by implication, they're making sort of sense of their own era, the way in which they actually approach the past. So the idea of classification is a means of disseminating knowledge, but at the same time it's a way of trying to exert control over that knowledge.
Faced with ambiguity, our instinct is to sort and to categorise and to name. And the 19th century is a period when, for instance, all the animals and all the plants are all identified as species, and the range and the diversity of human sexuality gets chopped up into a series of categories. And then it's quite hard to deal with ambiguous evidence if perhaps the society didn't work by those categories.
As the archaeologists of the 19th century chipped away at the past, they exposed barely readable sexual symbols, images which defied and still defy easy analysis.
A lot of this stuff is quite ambiguous, even at the most basic level between male and female, and you can find all kinds of sexual elements, but not in the sort of absolutely straightforward way you can say, this is what's going on. This is a little carving from prehistoric Malta, and it shows a woman with her hands between her legs. It's the kind of ambiguous imagery nearly all the prehistoric stuff is. What's she doing? Is she giving birth? Is she masturbating? Is she just sitting there with her hands on the top of her thighs? This one, it's another beautiful carving, and it seems to show a lion, and there were lions in Ice Age Europe, licking an erect penis. Goodness knows what that means. And whether it's real or fantasy, I don't know.
The Victorian erotic scholar approached his material with the aim of removing ambiguity, of fixing and controlling it. But he was caught in a cultural paradox. In order to classify and control sexual material, he needed to discuss it. For it to be discussed, it needed to be published. But once published, the information would become public.
Whereas in the secret museum, the objects can be kept under lock and key, the problem is when you start cataloguing that material, classifying it, and making it available in the form of books. And of course, we have to bear in mind that in an era of increasing technology, this knowledge can become promiscuous. And the Obscene Publications Act was passed in response to a perceived increase in sort of mass forms of literature and sort of visual forms, which were seen to be proliferating throughout the various classes in society and contaminating them. So the question, therefore, is how far should this knowledge become available to other people in society? If it falls into their hands, what use are they going to make of it? And I think this anxiety can be seen in these catalogues of the secret museum.
We have taken all the prudential measures applicable to such a collection of engravings and text. We have endeavoured to make its reading inaccessible, so to speak, to poorly educated persons, as well as to those whose sex and age forbid any exception to the laws of decency and modesty.
The way of confining access to that material is to impose these sort of safeguards within the text itself. One famous example of that, I suppose, are the illustrations for Barré's catalogue of the Secret Museum in Naples, published in the 1870s. The engravers of these objects are actually instructed to diminish the scale of the genitals, so the eye is not drawn unduly to them. And where there are scenes of copulation, those sort of areas are actually omitted altogether and sort of covered with these fog patches.
The truly erotic nudity of these rare subjects has thereby been stripped of the excessively crude and impertinent features that marked the originals. They have lost their importance. Sometimes, without detriment, they have utterly vanished.
Now, this obviously reveals some sort of anxiety, doesn't it, really? You do get these sort of justifications, these continual justifications, this oscillation between describing works in a way that it seems to be sort of arousing desire, and yet immediately having to sort of shut down those responses. And quite a few times this guard of self-control or neutrality breaks down in certain sort of flashes of fantasy or imagination.
The marble seems to palpitate. In contemplating it, modesty takes alarm, desire begins to awake, and imagination to kindle, and we are obliged to hurry away in order to restore our agitated senses to their original tranquility.
It's one of the myths of the 20th century that Victorians were very repressed about sexuality. It's not true. What they were was passionate about repressing. And the way to repress it was constantly to say, you mustn't talk about it. Of course, by saying you mustn't talk about it, precisely what you're doing is talking about it.
Once pornography was defined, once it came into being, the debate is set up. And the only way on from there, with knowledge being disseminated, images being disseminated, is that the debate is going to spread out and it's going to proliferate, and it's going to generate and regenerate itself. There's no way it can be brought back and contained.
In Dorset, a chalk figure, probably Roman, stands guard over the village of Cerne Abbas. Without doubt, his most distinguishing feature is a large erect phallus, which measures over 8 feet in length.
The Cerne Abbas giant is a really telling example of how the erect penis became hugely problematic in the 19th century. We have records of what the figure was like from 1764 with his big club and with his erect penis and his big balls. Already by 1774, the 19th century anxiety is beginning to show itself. He's just the same, except his cock and balls have now disappeared. By 1842, we're into the Victorian era, and at that point, the details are there, down to his ribs, and then everything below, there's just the outline. He's got no parts, he's got no navel, he's got no anything down there at all.
For the entire 19th century, the Cerne giant's phallus was excised. Without the weapon that he had brandished, he was now no more than a hollow threat. And though his phallus was eventually replaced in the early years of this century, his symbolic emasculation indicates a huge shift in attitude. While modern culture hides the phallus, many ancient cultures displayed it everywhere.
This is a statue of Priapus. He punishes those who steal from the garden. And the way he punishes them is with this, with his phallus, and he stuffs anybody, boy, girl, man, woman, who dares to steal from the garden. So this is his weapon. But he's a comic god as well, and people are supposed to laugh at the Priapus because the Romans followed the Greeks in believing that the proper aesthetic penis for the male is a small one. No one would ever want to admit having a big member. There's a wonderful quote in a comedy by Aristophanes, and he says, now if you follow the right philosophy, you're going to end up with broad shoulders, a big butt, and a small dick. And if you don't, you'll end up with hunched shoulders, a slack butt, and a big one.
A glance at the contents of the secret museum is ample demonstration of the Victorians' reaction to the phallus. But in Roman culture, the symbol was used both as decoration and as a good luck charm.
Wherever there's danger, a liminal space, a threshold, a transition zone is, in virtually all culture, a point of danger as you go from one thing to another, as you go from public space to private space. At that point, you use the potent symbol for protection. The phallus therefore belongs at the front door. This object here is a herm or a priapus, and he's pouring an offering from a little oil bottle here onto his own phallus, just as the householders would presumably make little offerings to the phallus at the door. So it's a self-offering phallus. And again, this is simply to ward off evil spirits, to bring good luck to the house, but it's also done with humour, with artistic style, with charm. I think it's incredibly hard to explain the strength of our taboo about the phallus. It's not clear that there's anything in the Bible or any other text that completely makes it unacceptable, but historically, the erect penis has become the unshowable object. And that is the common theme of virtually everything in this pornographic collection, that the penis is there visible.
Despite greater sort of liberal legislation in the 20th century, you could say that there's almost more anxiety attached to that area, the erect penis. In fact, I think the one thing you cannot actually show in mass-circulated literature or performance is an erect penis, or the penis in the process of transformation.
Even in the 20th century, so-called liberated society, that's still the taboo image. Well, for who is being protected and from what? One can't help wondering whether it isn't something to do with phallocratic power, that men need now to keep the penis, the phallus, veiled in some way, hidden. After all, who is being protected from this image? Who is threatened by its being seen?
At Cerne Abbas, the threat was to the social order itself. The local gentry were alarmed by the corrupting effect of this defiant symbol on the labouring classes of the village.
It would have been full of poor and labouring people in the 19th century, and there is this great hill figure way above it. And one can imagine how upsetting and uncomfortable it would have been for a Victorian proprietor in the order of things if that hill figure had a huge erect penis as a kind of emblem above the village, which needed a kind of moral order to it.
This fear of the effect of sexual imagery on the class structure was at the very heart of the debate about pornography. The new middle class felt that their interests were best served by locking the doors of the secret museum and transforming images of sex into pornography, controllable by law.
With the rise of the bourgeoisie, a considerable degree of social regulation goes into controlling working class elements from above. Central to the economic success of the British Empire is a controlled working class at home working. And one of the most specific threats that came about from the desirable ideal of universal education was that through access to the sorts of material of Pompeii, the working classes might become corrupted away from their social role as defined within Victorian society and culture.
They're really worried about the animal nature of human beings. And they feel, of course, they don't say this, that the lower classes are more animal. And since they're more animal, you don't want to fire that up with images like these. All these protections are essentially a way of preserving power and keeping people in their place. You don't want to let them know that the Romans were quite relaxed with it, and quite relaxed with it at every class level. In fact, it was one of the ways in which the classes were quite similar in ancient Rome. Although you were nothing, you were a thing if you were a slave, you still were expected to enjoy the pleasures of sex and to have objects, if you could afford them, and they would be very cheap, that would have images of sexual pleasure on them. A good example, of course, is this room, which is a cook's room of the House of the Vetii. It's right off the kitchen, and the Vetii were two brothers who were former slaves. This painting, although not the finest in the house, is a way of showing that I even gift my slaves in this very wonderful, magnanimous way, show them the most beautiful kind of lovemaking they can have. Here she's wearing a breast band, a lot of times she has anklets and so on. The idea is, this is a luxury product. This is something that you aspire to, it's something you want and you really prize.
The 20th century still feels profoundly ambivalent towards images of sex. While we would find it hard to embrace Roman attitudes to sexual representation, we are equally unwilling to define ourselves in terms of Victorian values. The secretum at the British Museum no longer exists, at least not in its original form. Many of the best artifacts have been absorbed into the museum proper, placed in context with other objects from their respective periods. But the remnants of Witt's collection still lie in cupboard 55, a reminder of an outdated morality. The terracotta copy of Pan penetrating the she-goat is not on public display. The pornographic collection in the Secret Museum at Naples has been moved from its locked room within the museum proper, but has not, on the whole, been displayed to the public. It is kept in a storeroom in an off-limits area of the museum. To visit it, a written application is still required. The original marble of Pan and the goat is not on public display.
Despite the lurid images that are available in modern culture, we are much closer to the Victorians than we would care to be. We don't like to think of ourselves as the new Victorians because everybody needs to cut themselves away from their immediate past to reconstruct themselves. But there are more inheritances in our present culture from Victorian regulations than there are from Roman culture.
One of the enduring legacies of the Victorian era is the firm grip which pornography has on our collective psyche. Pornography has penetrated our culture in exactly the way that the Victorians most feared, aided by the debate that they began in 1857 with the first legislation against looking.
Once you start trying to define what pornography is, i.e. putting it into words, then that's going to lead to reinterpretation, re-revision, redefinition, and so the debate perpetuates itself, and so it spreads and becomes more prolific. This has been sort of perpetuated through this continuing sort of discourse, really, about sort of pornography and its effect on audiences. So the big paradox of pornography is in that trying to define and contain it, it has the actual reverse effect. It actually sort of disseminates itself.
Wherever we stand in the pornographic debate, the vehemence with which we discuss it reveals that we believe that images of sex have enormous power, either for good or for bad.
These images of sex are framed in an alien culture, and we think that's okay. But as soon as we turn to our own culture or our own cultures and start to examine our attitudes towards sexual representation, we go crazy. We have polemic going right and left and every which way. It gives an enormous amount of power to the images. And this is the same kind of power that the Victorians gave to images of sex.
Inescapably, we're the heirs of our Victorian ancestors. The moment you set up the category of the pornographic, the moment you say that area is separate from and different from, you can change the rules, the internal rules that define the pornography as much as you like, but it will still remain separate in a way that wasn't true of the Roman world.
Pornography is here to stay as an idea, and it's something that no matter what the forms are that we tack this name onto, we have a cultural construction that we can't wriggle out of. It is something that's going to continue. We've named it, and it's become part of our culture, and it's not going to go away.
We have also inherited from the last century our awareness and our fear that technology and pornography go hand in hand, and that technology has the potential to break the boundaries of the secret museum.
With technology, the way of controlling pornography becomes more and more difficult. Nowadays, images are everywhere. So what hands are they going to fall into? This becomes the big question. And how do you regulate on that?
The threat of the internet is that the walls of the secret museum will come tumbling down and unregulated images will circulate freely throughout society. And that is seen as a threat. The image of poison that we're familiar from Victorian society returns again. We may sometimes want to break down the walls and see the end of the secret museum, but without walls, we have no security. So we're still struggling with what sort of a construction we want to build.
In the 15th century, erotic image making was completely transformed by the invention of a revolutionary new technology, the printing press. Sexual imagery of the medieval and Renaissance periods was surprisingly explicit. But it was only available as harmless titillation to an educated, wealthy elite. Mass production made erotica available to new and wider audiences, taking it beyond the private and into the public realm. Thrown into moral panic, church and state reacted with a campaign of censorship, starting a battle between the authorities and those who produced and consumed erotic imagery that still defines the pornographic today. By the 18th century, pornographic literature and images were not only widespread, but had become important to the expression of philosophical and political ideas. And these ideas would ultimately result in nothing less than revolution. Ironically, religion had sanctioned some of the first examples of sexually explicit imagery. Hidden within the pages of prayer books dating from the 13th century are illustrations that provided sexual stimulation for the wealthy individuals who commissioned them. These tiny sexually explicit images provide the earliest evidence of erotica intended to be privately enjoyed. Secreted away in places such as the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York, these precious books of hours, or prayer books for the laity, are rarely displayed to the public.
These books do have usually a whole series of normal religious pictures, but in the margins there are little funny things going on, what might be called little naughty bits, and they're very much a presence in these manuscripts. They're not at all unusual. Then I'm speaking of a period from the mid-13th to the 16th century. Books were not widely available. If a family owned, let's say, just one book, they owned a book of hours. So they weren't able to compartmentalize their interest in prayer, let's say, from their interest in erotica. So you end up finding them in the same book. We find that very odd, but it's completely normal and acceptable for that period. They could enjoy the pictures, but if they were not actually doing it, it wasn't a sin. So for us, what we think is a very odd juxtaposition of the profane next to the religious was not at all a problem for medieval men and women. This is a particularly nice marginal figure, two of them here. This is a clear depiction of oral sex where a penitent is kneeling in front of the naked buttocks of a monk who happens to be actually nothing but a head attached to the buttocks and legs, and he's kissing the buttocks. This particular book is an Italian mid-15th century book of hours. It's quite beautiful. There are two illustrations that if you look at them very carefully and closely, you begin to wonder what's going on. And in the first one, there is a scene called the First Bath of Christ. If you look very carefully at what's going on between his legs, you see what looks like an unbelievably prodigious endowment for a child of that age. It's actually not the Christ's penis, but it is the fingers of the Virgin projecting through in between the legs of the child. Now, lest you think that this is a complete accident and that it is Roger having a Freudian moment looking at the miniature, if you turn to a second illustration in the book, there is the scene